way for agency owners to begin to sell accessibility to their clients. And so when you think about it, it impacts potentially 25% of all adults. That's a lot of broadening your potential audience, right? There's a huge,
Hmm.
if you would pay a lot of money just to get a fraction of that broadening, right? So you can
Sure.
increase your audience. You can, when you do accessibility right, you're not only improving that user experience for people with disabilities, you almost always improve that user experience for everybody else.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the High Level Spotlight Sessions, where we showcase awesome marketers doing awesome marketing. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Bet Hannon. She's the founder and CEO of Accessicart, which is a services-based agency that focuses on web accessibility and e-commerce. Bet, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
I'm excited to have you. We met, has it been 2 months now, I guess? We
Oh, I
met on
think
a webinar for, I can't remember which, I think it was
Go
a WordPress
WP.
group, right? Go
Go
WP.
WP. Yep.
Got it.
Yep.
Which has
Was
evolved to be more than just a WordPress group, right?
Yeah, I think we met actually on the agency owners kind of happy
That's
hour,
right.
and then you were promoting the webinar you were going to do. So
Yeah. That's right. I got invited to speak to the group. We had a great time. And
you did.
I guess in the chat, I quickly realized that Bet is an accessibility expert. And so I extended the invite to come on the show because it's a topic we have not discussed before. And it's actually a topic I know very little about, even though I ran a team that built hundreds of WordPress websites um, back when I was running an agency. And it's probably something I should have been thinking about. So Bet, why don't we start with that? Like what is accessibility and why should people care?
Yeah, and I don't know, when you say I should have known, it certainly is something. Accessibility has sort of been growing in kind of
Mm-hmm.
urgency and kind of conversations more recently, and so it's growing. So web accessibility is making sure that your website works, is usable by people who have disabilities. So if a person is blind, they use a screen reader to read out the content, not just the content, but the placeholders and the markers and the structure of the page. And your
Mm-hmm.
website has to be put together properly for that to work for them. If somebody
Mm-hmm.
is can't use a mouse for a variety, maybe they don't have a hand, maybe they're paralyzed, then they also have to they can get through the website with an accessibility device of some kind, but all of those devices come down to keyboard navigation and getting through the website. And then, we can talk about not just those are the kind of things people initially think of, but website accessibility includes a whole variety of disabilities, including things like color blindness and
Mm-hmm.
reading disabilities. And even we begin to think sometimes about anxiety and depression, right? If you create a process that's super long and you're not telling people how far they are through the process, they can just bounce off because they can't deal with that anxiety of that. So all kinds of things, but it's basically making your website more usable for people with disabilities. And sometimes I think people are surprised when they hear that, we think of that as a really small number of people. But in the United States, the CDC says that that's about 25% of all US adults. Oh, and
Wow.
that's similar in other developed nations, right?
Hmm.
So it's not a small
That's a
number.
big,
It's a big
no,
number.
that's a big number of people. And I feel like anybody who has a friend, a family, a loved one with a disability, you can quickly relate to how frustrating it is for a person who's
Yeah.
trying to access information or something
Yeah.
and can't.
I
Um,
try to be real careful about, inspiration porn, but when you get a glimpse for when you do this work to make your website more accessible, what it can do for people's human dignity and being able to live an independent life, they don't have to depend on friends or family
mm,
members, or even strangers to like help them do things on the web, which we all do so much more on
mhm.
the web today. It's a powerful thing. I mean, it's a big deal, and we talk about it. It's a there's some kind of it's just the right thing to do. Right? You would
Yeah,
never like slam the door of your store to somebody, right? If you were a store owner.
for
And so it's
sure.
the same kind of thing, right? Being
Yeah,
more
for sure.
inclusive.
Now, Now, the flip side of it, just to be completely honest, is like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, extra work now I need to think about. It's like first we got to
Well,
design the thing, then we build the thing, and then we got to SEO the thing, and now there's this other thing we got to do.
yeah.
So
Yep.
before we get into kind of that conversation, is there a legal urgency here as well?
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Let me get to the legal issue, but let me say,
Okay.
um, while you might think about it as extra work,
Mhm.
there's a flip side to think about it, the positives and the business positives for doing this. And this is a great way for agency owners to
Mm.
begin to sell accessibility to their clients. And so when you think about it, it impacts potentially 25% of all adults. That's a lot of broadening your potential audience, right? There's a huge,
Mhm.
if you would pay a lot of money just to get a fraction of that broadening, right? So you can
Sure.
increase your audience. You can, when you do accessibility right, you're not only improving that user experience for people with disabilities, you almost always improve that user experience for everybody else. So people who
Mm.
are aging and having trouble with smaller print, people who are on their phone in a bright sunlight, somebody that's holding a wiggly baby, all of those people get a better user experience when a site is accessible. And then
Mm.
third, almost always when you do accessibility correctly, you're improving your SEO because of all the structural pieces of the site all the technical pieces you're doing. So while it is,
That
yes,
makes sense.
more stuff, you do, there's some big benefits too. It's not just an outlay piece,
Well,
right?
I would imagine, and again, we'll talk about the legal stuff in a second, that another big benefit is differentiation between your agency and others, kind of like with HIPAA,
Absolutely.
right? A lot of
Absolutely.
agencies ignore HIPAA, and it's like, I don't know who else you're talking to, but if they're not taking this seriously, they could be leading you right into a problem here.
Yep, exactly. And so if you begin to do accessibility and talk about accessibility in what you're putting out in terms of proposals and client projects and talking to people, I think that can be a great differentiator. The best advice I ever got though, when we were starting to do this, was to never ever offer accessibility as an option to be turned down. Because if you
Mm.
do that, what you're doing is saying, well, I'll let you save some money by throwing disabled people under the bus. And
Mm-hmm.
it just is not a great look,
That's a
right?
bad look.
It's a bad look. And so I think sometimes people don't think about it in that way. And so, part of it is just it's a commitment to doing things right. Just like no self-respecting agency would build a website today that's not mobile responsive, or
Sure.
right, that doesn't have some level of SEO on it. All of those things. It's just another one of those pieces that we do because we're we're proud of the craft we do. And
Mm-hmm.
but it can be a
100%.
differentiator.
And again, a savvy business person is also going to, you know,
Absolutely.
float, dangle, suggest, like lead to the idea that, while all of our plans include this, our competitors often do not. And,
Yep.
there are some potential legal ramifications here. So let's get into
Yeah.
that. What
Let's
is it?
talk
What's
into
the
that.
scary side of this?
Well, a lawsuit is the scary side of it. So
Sure.
in the U.S., and it's different in different places in the world, and I'm not sure how global your audience is, but in the U.S. we don't have any generally speaking, don't have any specific laws around website accessibility um,
Okay.
that are national. Right. So you
Hmm.
get some in California, and there are some other places that are beginning to talk about that. But so what's left is that people with disabilities um, are suing website owners under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, ADA was signed in 1990 before websites were really so much of a thing, and it doesn't deal explicitly with websites, but there have been some court cases that now make it pretty clear that that they do consider that a place. And now there are some levels of what needs to happen. So there's some different law. There is a law that the government websites must be accessible. So any level of government, from federal down through tiny little cities and counties, all of those websites have to be accessible. Also have to be accessible education sites. And then what's called public accommodation. And so that's where we start hitting this gray area. So there's some public accommodations that's pretty clear you need to be accessible. Banks, utilities, anything that, my garbage company website should probably be accessible because people with disabilities have to pay their garbage bills, right? Those,
Mhm.
anywhere where a consumer is kind of mandated to use it or ought to be able
Mhm.
to use it as a citizen, those have to be accessible. Then we start getting into a lot of what's a public accommodation, right? And so there have been some court cases that have gone, both ways, but the kind of preponderance of evidence is that we're moving toward, everybody sort of sees that we're going to all have to be accessible. And it may take
Mhm.
us 3 or 5 or 10 years until we're required to do it in that way. But in the meantime, the way people are doing this is with lawsuits. And so you also have what are called the predatory lawsuits. So one
Mhm.
plaintiff, typically a blind person, and one attorney together might sue hundreds
Just
of
go on a
websites.
rampage.
They just go on a rampage. And uh, and sometimes it's just like we saw there was one set of people that sued all the museums in New York State, starting with the A's, and they're working their way down an alphabetical list. And so, while it can seem like those are scammy, and initially, what you would do is you get a letter. Typically, you get what's called a demand letter first, and the intent to sue. And what they're hoping is that they will not have to sue you, that you'll settle. And so you get the demand
Mhm.
letter, and they can look really spammy and scammy. And, one of our clients got one from a lawyer that had been disbarred 3 times. And, it's just
Yeah.
kind of wild west. But you need to take them seriously. You need to take them seriously. The website owner needs to get legal representation. You can push back some, depending on what's going on. People may need to, may want to settle, even if they are compliant, but it may be cheaper, right? And you would think
Sure.
that these predatory suits are going after the, bigger revenue sites with deeper pockets, but actually they come after some pretty small, small businesses too. So it's not a guarantee. Um, I do think that all of those reasons we talked about before, in terms of their benefits, that it's not that when you're selling accessibility to people, it's the fear of the lawsuit is not maybe the best motivator, but it is the
Mhm.
thing that most people kind of come to. And I
Is
recently
there
was
a
saying, I don't like the fear mongering, right? I don't like the fear mongering. And somebody said, well, why would you not want to talk about risk? That's what, like, there's whole industries like insurance built on that. And I was like, well, okay, but I think the
for
positive
sure?
reasons are there too. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's definitely valid to talk about all the sides of it. Is there a a badge or something like a HIPAA compliance type of
no,
badge that you can put on your site once you know that you're compliant and use that as again a signal of, hey, we're a step above our competitors here?
no, not really. And I mean, part of it is that no website is really 100% complete, compliant, right? There really is no
Okay.
such thing as 100% compliant. It's kind of like SEO in that way, right? There's low kind of base best practices, and then you can be doing all kinds of things above those base practices, but it never ends, right? There's always
Mm.
optimizations to happen because it's essentially a user optimization, user experience optimization. And so there's not a badge, and even what it means to be compliant is sometimes really un, not clear cut, because some of it
Mhm.
is how things are implemented and the context for them. And so, you can, that's, I think, what makes it really difficult sometimes is to,
Hmm.
there's not something clear cut. Now, what we recommend, you can do what's called a voluntary uh, project accessibility. Well, it's basically a self report that you're accessible, but
Okay.
they get to be expensive and they're not really things people look for. But what we recommend is that people put an accessibility policy or accessibility statement in the footer right next to the privacy policy. And so, not just kind of right down there with the privacy policy. And on your accessibility statement, you're going to say, generally they have like 3 little statements. And one says, we want this website to be usable by everybody. We're trying to follow the WCAG, WCAG, Website Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 at AA, whatever the standard is that you're trying to find. And then just an acknowledgement, third, that website accessibility is, is an ongoing matter. And if you find something that's not accessible, please be in touch. And so it gives you a chance to put it out there that you're working on it, and that people, now that's not a fail safe to keep you from getting sued, but it's an invitation, and it's out there, and people that see it, it can be very powerful, and that can be a real driver for what we call values-driven buyers, right? So people who are concerned about sweatshops, or concerned about the local economy, right? Those values-driven people, the accessibility statement can be a great piece of that.
Sure. Again, if you have a disabled person in your family, it probably means a lot when you see that on a website.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you, for example, we see this maybe, and it's easier to tell maybe with e-commerce sites, but if you're an e-commerce site that is accessible to people with disabilities, and somebody who's disabled figures that out, they are A, then incredibly loyal to you, and B, they will trumpet your site to a lot of other people. So
Sure.
you want some incredibly loyal customers, you can reach out with.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So are there some low-hanging fruit best practices that you could give us?
Yeah, the WCAG is a kind of a lots of technos speak kind of piece, and you can find there's a lot of places where you can find some WordCamp presentations, or the accessibility talks presentations, a lot of kind of webinars out there with kind of basic best practices. But, they come down to, they say that about 80% of all accessibility issues have to do with some of the content on the site, making sure that you have alt text on your images, your heading structures, the H tag structure is properly nested, that those 2 things alone would be about 80% of issues. But then you're looking
at what you said. It's like double dipping with SEO. If you're doing good on-page SEO, it sounds like you're checking a lot of accessibility boxes.
Yeah. And so then things like color contrast, that's a big one. And then making sure that your site is keyboard navigable. So if you go to your website and you just start pressing the tab key, so people who are blind use keyboard navigation, and people who are have mobility disabilities. And so if you start pressing the tab key, you should be able to see a little outline of where you are. Now, some developers turn off that focus indicator outline, which is, why would you turn it off? Nobody sees it except if they're needing it. And so, but you can tab through and hit return and try to see how far you can get through your website. And that's sometimes very enlightening how, it's maybe not as easy as you might hope, but. Or sometimes if pop-ups, or for example, sometimes a pop-up will open, or your search box will open, and then the person who's keyboard navigating can't get out of it. That's a big problem when the pop-up is your cart.
I mean, I have full use of my hands and sight, and sometimes I can't figure out how to close a pop-up, and that drives me insane. Are there any tools that you could, like a scanner tool where you can throw a URL in there and it'll tell you?
Yeah, there are. One of them is called the WAVE tool, WAVE, and you could just Google WAVE accessibility and you'll find that tool. That's a great one. There's you can put on the Axe tools on the Chrome inspector, and that's another one. It's important though, and those are
What's the Chrome extension called?
Axe accessibility tools, AXE. Okay. And the important thing to know, though, and those are great, there's some color contrast checkers where you can put in the hex code of the font and the hex code of the background, and it'll tell you if you're meeting the contrast guidelines, and then how big the font. Sometimes you can meet the color contrast guideline if the font is big enough, right? And then if the font is too small, then it has to be a higher contrast, right? And so those tools will help you do that. The important thing to know, though, is that those sorts of online tools and tests will only help you with about 30% of accessibility issues. So, for example, you can put that WAVE tool on, and there's actually a Chrome extension for Wave. You could put that on there, but it can't tell you if your site is keyboard navigable, right? It can only test what AI can test. So they're great tools to get you. I mean, use those tools as a start, but just
Mhm.
know that they're not going to be everything you need. And so that's why you need to be suspicious when somebody says they're going to do an audit and all they do is run it through those AI checkers, because they're probably missing a lot, right? And so,
Hmm.
and the same with, sometimes I don't know if you want to get into the controversy here, but there's there's some overlay plugins. So some familiar names might be Userway or Accessibee, and so they promote themselves as sort of a one-click stop for making your site accessible. Well, the thing is, they use AI, and they can only fix those things that AI can fix. So maybe about 30% of issues, but they also, if a person is disabled and they need those tools that overlay provides, they've already got them installed because the 99% of other websites they need them on. And so when you put that overlay on, it conflicts with their tools and neither one of them work. And so
Hmm.
lots of disabled people are blocking those overlays because they don't want to have to deal with
What?
it. And then recently we've become aware that there's privacy issues that when the disabled person puts in that I need magnification, or I need color changes, blah blah blah. All of those things are stored by the platform, but without notifying the user. And there's no way
Hmm.
for the user to remove that data, like under GDPR, where you have to notify them about the data you're storing. And so there's some concerns about whether it meets privacy law pieces too. So overlays,
Interesting.
you might want to go to overlayfactsheet.com. That's a great kind of sort of help you understand what overlays are and how they work and why they are not real great. And then like over 700 accessibility professionals have signed this statement about overlays. And so, but
Interesting. So then I'm assuming you talked about some tools. I appreciate that. People can go check those out.
mhm.
Um, I'm assuming that if you get called in to do an audit, you guys know how to check 100% or
And that's really why
95%,
you're
let's say.
calling in an outside agency, is that you're wanting
Mhm.
folks that are going to use the tools, but also then do the human testing, right? And so when we do an
Got it.
audit, we do we typically do you almost never anymore get all the pages of a website audited unless it's a very small site, right? So we
Mhm.
typically do about 10 URLs or views. Sometimes the what's on the page can change without changing the URL. So but we do 10 URLs or views, and we try to help the clients then pick a variety of templates and just layouts and all of those, just so we're making sure we get everything. But between that, you get all the global things, the menu and the footer, and then you get on those usually you can get a pretty good idea of the accessibility of the site. And then the other piece of what we do is we're doing that human testing. Then we provide an hour of consult to help you understand what's there. Usually, the site owners that come to us have their own development team, and those folks can implement the changes once they know what needs to be changed. But if they need to, they could come back and do a little more checking with us or consultation with us and all that. But
Hmm.
so it's a
And do you do this in a white labeled or a resellable manner? Like if I have an agency, is there a business model here where I kind of say, hey, would you be interested in an accessibility report? And then I'm essentially having your team run it and I'm just putting a margin on that?
You could do that. It makes it kind of a little awkward to do that consultation with the developer who did the audit then, because then they're clearly not a part of your team. What we have
Hmm.
done with some agencies is instead of doing white labeling, I mean, I'm open to that. I'd talk to people, but what we have done instead is just give a referral fee back to the agency, or give it to them at a bit of a discount, and they can upsell it. And
Now, do you guys also then make the changes? I could see a bit of an embarrassment factor here, right? If I'm like, I recommend you come in and you're like, wow, whoever made this really screwed it up. And then they come back to me and they're like, you
Yeah,
need to redo this whole thing
we
because
we have had a couple of agencies that say we don't want the client to know that we're doing this yet. right?
Gotcha.
We just want to do this, right? And so, I mean, we've had a couple agencies do that. Um, it can be. I think we try to be gentle, and we are, our approach is educative, right? We just want to educate
Hmm.
the client, educate the agency, the developers on that. We have had some folks who, some agencies where they just said, look, this is we're just really newly aware of this, and in our niche is really newly aware
Hmm.
of this. We're going to call these folks in. Let's work together, and we sort of work together with them. We do remediations, but typically I mean, that's pretty less common, I think, in some ways. Um, you know, typically the agency folks want to have their people get up to speed to know how to do this, right? And there's
Yeah,
also the added benefit that if the developer has to go back and fix these things themselves, then they're less likely to make that same mistake, implement that same issue again.
that was going to be my next point, right? It sounds like it's probably worth having you guys come and audit, if I'm building websites, one of my sites, just so I know, because if there is an issue, I'm assuming I would be like, oh, got it. Moving forward,
We
we're
do that.
not,
We do that
we
on
just,
every site. We should go back and fix that, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
So we do that, and we also do consulting work. So if we've done this with several agencies where they have a client that they know has to be accessible, right? It's a
Mm,
bank or credit union. It's they know that there's an accessibility requirement there, and so sometimes
mhm.
they'll just build it into the project budget that they're going to bring us in to consult along the way to make sure that things are up to speed. And typically there you mentioned at the beginning, like, accessibility is another thing I have to add on. I just want to kind
Mhm.
of put out there that that's the most expensive way to do accessibility. So it's it's much better if you start at the beginning with and kind of have some touch points along the way. And so what we typically do when we're going to do that is we would be in to visit with the developers as they're thinking about feature development. Which plugins are they going to use? Which custom coding are they going to do? What should they be looking out for? Where are some resources for putting that together in a more accessible way? Then look at talking with the design team about color contrast, color schemes and contrast, and then also mock-ups, touch point there. And then we recommend, although people don't always want to, have us come in after you've gotten started with the build out and you're part way, typically when you've got a little bit of the content done, because the content people putting in the content can create issues too, right? So if we come in early and we catch what they're doing and we get that fixed early, then you don't have to go back and fix that later. And so now you can see at the end is the most expensive thing. If you realize this feature that you spent all this time building out now has to be recoded and
Mhm.
yeah, all of those things. Um,
That makes sense. Yeah. And
yeah,
that's interesting for sure. If you're working with a bank or a government agency or something like that, it makes sense to say, hey, we
yeah.
need to make sure that this is a part of the process here.
Yeah, well, and increasingly e-commerce or other kinds of user interaction sites, they're becoming aware that they need to be accessible. So it's not, I would think about it as something you could offer and then, put it out there. We do work with folks in one other kind of capacity, and that's with some in terms of their own retainer work. So if an agency has retainers with clients where they have a bucket of hours and they're pitching things to, improve the
Hmm.
website. Typically, if the agency has us come in for every hour, they have us do not an audit, but just assessment of the site, we can just list out and kind of prioritize what's the most impactful things to start changing. They can generate 3 to 5 hours of billable labor from every hour they have us spending on the site, maybe more,
There we go.
depending on the site.
Yeah. That sounds like a pretty good business model. I like it. Um, so Bet, I know the website, your website is accessicart.com, ACCESSI cart.com. And you guys have a pretty robust blog full of content, right? If somebody's interested in kind of just learning more about this and
Yep.
reading up on it, would you say
Yep.
your blog is a good resource?
I would say so. We have some, downloadable resources, and we try to make it a good resource piece. But there's some other places that folks could look for help. One of the places that, if people are new to accessibility and they're wanting to try and get on board, DEQUE.com. They are a services company, but they also have an online learning kind of component. And they have some self-paced online learning. And so for instance, they have a great module that just introduces people to basically, the world of disabilities and disability law, and just helping people kind of wrap their head around the different sorts of disabilities that impact website development. And anytime we get somebody new on our team, we make even like the support agents, right? We just make sure they've taken that, and then they have some other
Mhm.
additional ones for people that are doing more development pieces. And so that's a great resource. There is a WordPress, and while I say these WordPress, I know that people have their own platforms and other things, right? We typically come out of WordPress world, but a lot of accessibility stuff is really platform agnostic. And so
Mhm.
you can get some great resources. There's a WordPress accessibility meetup that is global, and they meet twice a month online. And some
Hmm.
great, just some of the most, best known, really highly acclaimed accessibility experts that are doing webinars and giving presentations. And they have a whole archive of stuff. So if you have a particular topic that you're looking for help on, you might find a presentation on it there. That's a great spot. And then there's another meetup called Ally Talk. So accessibility is sometimes abbreviated A11Y because between the A and the Y in accessibility there are 11 letters. So A11Y Talks is a kind of, they do webinars and kind of presentation stuff, and they have an archive as well. So some great resources there. The WordPress meetup also has a Facebook group. Ally Talks has a Slack channel. In general, accessibility folk are really generous about trying to help
I was going
people
to say,
wrap
it
their
sounds like
heads
a
around all of
pretty,
this, right? And so
pretty giving community to be a part of.
you can ask your questions. People may refer you to, resources around or be able to answer your question. Obviously, you should do a little of your own homework before you show up, but like, uh, but yeah, those are great places to ask and answer, get answers to questions. So.
That's awesome. And so if any of our community are listening, they'd like to learn more, maybe reach out to you as far as possibly working together, should they just head to accessicart.com
Yeah,
and
there's
hit
a
the contact
contact
page?
form there. That's great. Yeah, that's probably the best. I used to say
Cool.
Twitter, and now it's hard to know what's going on with Twitter.
I,
I will say,
it's still my favorite network.
yeah, I know this is a lot. There's a lot that's going on, but I'll just say, since we're talking to agency owners and people that are interested or thinking about selling accessibility, there is another kind of great way to sell accessibility because it does bring some added costs, and that is
Okay.
anytime anyone is improving the accessibility of their website, whether that's getting an audit, having remediations done, or building a new website that has accessibility included, they may be eligible for a tax credit of up to
Hmm.
50% of the expense, up to $10,000. So they can spend up to $10,000. They can get a non-refundable, so it just reduces what they owe by $5,000. That's pretty significant. I mean, up to that. They have to be either under 30 employees or under $1 million in revenue. And so some of the higher end folks may not qualify, and of course those are only U.S. based businesses. But it's a great kind of. We've had a number of clients
That's
that have
really
taken advantage of
interesting.
that.
So
Yep,
if I'm
and it's
selling a website for $8,000 and I can say, but I might be able to get half of this back for you because,
well,
we build
better
under
than that, right?
accessibility
Better than that.
standards
You
or
say
whatnot.
if our typical website build has been $8,000, now we can say we're going to build an accessibility for you, and you charge $10,000, but the client is only going to have to pay. I mean, they have to
Mhm.
pay it out front. They do have to pay it up front, and then they're dealing with Uncle Sam and the the tax credit. And you want to make sure that if they're going to do that, that you're labeling your invoices very clearly around all of that accessibility improvements and all that.
That's
But
really interesting.
yeah,
So that goes back to you want to work with us because we, make sure that your site's going to be accessible. And because we're doing that work, you're likely eligible for a refund. And, here's how you can go about doing that after the project is finished.
Yep. Yep.
Where
It's
can
a
people learn more
great.
about that? That seems like very, very valuable.
There's a post on our blog. Just Google, just search blog, a tax credit on the blog.
Very cool.
Link to the form.
Well,
It's a very simple form too. It's not hard to claim. So
really, do you know what the typical turnaround on that is?
what do you mean with the turnaround?
Like of them actually processing the refund back to the business?
It's with your taxes, right?
Oh, got it.
So the business owner has to pay you the whole $10,000, but they're getting invoices from you that say accessibility, it was included, blah blah blah. They take those, they make sure they put those in with this form.
Got it.
And it's a pretty simple form to fill out, and then it gets submitted as a part of their tax return. And then theoretically, that gets all processed, and yeah.
Wow, that's great. Well, Bet, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this
welcome.
insight. I feel like I got a lot of actionable tips here. Sounds like some great tools to use. I love the policy. That sounds like a great idea. It honestly sounds like that would go a long way if somebody were to try to cause a problem. Documenting what you're doing, that you're trying to do the right thing there.
I just realized
I like that a lot.
We talked in the pre-show about liability, and we didn't mention that.
Oh, right.
Do you want to mention that real quickly? Okay.
Of course, yeah, go for it.
So while the client is liable for being sued under ADA, anytime you're doing, even if you're not doing accessibility work, I think you should be starting to include in your contract a release of liability. You can find on our blog a much more kind of verbose release of liability that Ryan Kenny did with us in conjunction with a WordCamp a couple of years back. But what I try to do is I just try to say, it's uncertain what meets criteria, and the legal landscape is changing. Therefore, we can't be responsible for any legal responsibility for making your website compliant with accessibility compliant. And ultimately, that is the responsibility of the site owner. So once they sign off on, ultimately it's the responsibility of the site owner. Then they may want to share the pain when they come back, when they get sued, but that kind of prevents them from doing that. And then additionally, in the process, if the client wants to do something that's not accessible. So for instance, we have a client that they're using this kind of beautiful salmon color, but with the white font on top of it is not color compliant. The color contrast is not compliant. So we come back to the client when they want to insist that they want to do this. We come back and ask them to sign another legal document that says, we've informed you that this particular choice is not accessible, and other choices that you may make may also not be accessible, but you're acknowledging that we have advised you of this, and you are committing to, if you get sued over this or any other accessibility issues, that you will be paying our expenses related to that lawsuit. Because if they get sued, you as the developer will almost certainly get pulled in to give depositions, to give testimony if it goes to court, right? And so even if it doesn't go to court, even if it's just in some kind of settlement thing, you may get pulled in, and you want to make sure that you're not having to pay out for your own attorney and all of those things on all of that. So you get to choose your own attorney and submit the bill to them. So you want to do that. 9 times out of 10, that makes the client go, oh, I guess I should take this all pretty seriously, and they change their mind and start going with your recommendations. Sometimes they do not, and that's their risk tolerance is their risk tolerance, and so but
that's a great piece of advice, though. I mean, it makes total sense to just add a clause into your contract template in regard to accessibility, for sure. And I think you illustrated the point there that also it's really important, because after you build it, if a client goes and makes a changes a color, then what was compliant is no longer compliant, and you want to make sure that can't come back to you as well.
Yeah.
I also like the fact that, like you said, anything that gets a client more in line with you on design is a positive in my book.
Yeah, it's important to realize that pretty much any change to the website can affect accessibility. Updating plugins, updating content, changes in the theme, All of those things can affect accessibility. So yeah, it's good to get yourself covered and to be sure
Makes
you're
sense.
keeping if your part of the project is delivering something that has some accessibility compliance with it, make sure you're keeping a copy of what you've delivered so that for
Mm,
future
that's
reference.
interesting as well. Right. You could say, no, it looked like this when
When we
we handed it
delivered
over.
it, it didn't look like that.
There was no salmon and white combination going on there.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Well, Bet, thanks so much for coming by. This has been really eye-opening. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I always love helping people learn about accessibility. So.
I have no doubt that the viewers learned a lot in this one. So thank you for watching, guys. We will see you in the next one.